What I'd like to discuss now is something called the collision shape. And this is a very important concept to remember because it's going to have a huge impact on how your actors collide with one another. So the first thing that we need to understand is something called the bounding box of the graphic. So if I were to click on my actor here inside my stage, you can see that the graphic completely fits the bounding box. And an easier way to understand this is to jump into a program like Photoshop where we can actually take a look at transparency. Now, if you're not familiar with programs like Photoshop, don't worry. Just for this set of tutorials, I want to kind of point out how transparency is working. So I'll jump over into Photoshop where I've already opened up some of the graphics that we're working with in this series. So you can see here we have kind of our ball actor, and we have our blob actor, and we have our block, and of course we have our ground actor. So if you take a look at the ground actor, you can see that there is no empty space between the pixels in the image and kind of the bounding box of the image itself. And the same thing with our block actor. You can see he kind of fills up this entire space 100%. But if we were to look at something that isn't perfectly rectangular, like the blob actor, you can see there's a lot of empty space here. And same thing is true with our ball actor. You can see here in the corners, there's a lot of empty space. Right on the bottom and left to right and at the top, we're actually touching the bounding box of the image, but we have all this empty space here. So what I'm trying to point out is GameSalad is only going to pay attention to the bounding box of the image. GameSalad cannot see the pixels inside the image. It only knows that there's a bounding box here. And to kind of make this even more clear, let me just go to our block actor here, and I'm just going to crop this image. So again, I'm just adding a lot of extra space above our little block guy's head here. And I want to make sure that that extra space is transparent. So it looks like our actor is just this. So here we have all of our pixels, but then our image itself, or the bounding box of the image, is much larger than the pixels. So I'm just going to save this out real quick. And I'm going to make sure I save it out with transparency. Again, don't worry about how I'm doing this. I'll call this guy block 2. And I'm going to bring this block image into GameSalad now. So just go up to my Media tab, hit the plus icon, and we want to go ahead and bring that block in. So block 2, open that up, and then we're going to make block 2 an actor. I'll get rid of block here inside my scene. And I'll just bring block 2 in. So if I click on block 2, you can see that this bounding box is much larger than the actual pixels. Now you may or may not want to do this, but in most cases you want to have the image fit the bounding box best that it can, and I'll show you why. Let's go into block 2 and set up some programming here. So the very first thing we need to do is make sure that block 2 actually collides with the ground. So I'm going to type in the word collide, and I'm just going to go ahead and select the ground actor. I then want block 2 to kind of move across my screen to the right. So that's very simple to do. I'll just type in the word move, and we're going to make sure that he is moving to the right. We'll test that out, and he moves to the right. So if I were to take the ground actor and place it somewhere above our block image, you would expect that this block image, or at least the player would expect that this block image can move underneath this ground actor because the ground is above the block and there's more than enough room here. But watch what happens if I preview this. You can see our block character gets hung up. And that's because his bounding box is really what GameSalad is paying attention to. Let me just go ahead and turn off fixed rotation as we learned in an earlier video. And I'm going to take the bounciness down to 0, of course. And then we'll preview this one more time. And you can see this guy automatically stops. So that's a really important thing to pay attention to, is how the bounding box is affecting collisions inside GameSalad. So now that we understand that, let's talk about how we can maybe improve things a tiny bit. There's two different collision shapes that we can actually work with in GameSalad. And those collision shapes are either a rectangle or a circle. So for instance, for my block actor here, if we go down to physics, you can see by default all actors have this rectangular collision shape, which is what you would expect. It is a rectangular representation of the bounding box, which is pretty accurate. But for other actors, like our blob, that aren't quite a square or a rectangle and aren't quite a circle, we have to kind of make a choice what works best with this image. So in this case, if we were to do a rectangular shape, let's experiment and see how that works. So we'll bring our blob in, and again give our blob some very simple programming, which would be we want you to collide with the ground just like we did before, and we want you to move to the right just like we did before. And what I want to do is get this cube to look like it's just above that area there. And let's take a look at how this simulation looks. And you can see if we look at this, it doesn't really look like our blob is actually touching the surface. The bounding box is touching the surface, but again, because this image doesn't go all the way to the bounding box, we have a bit of a problem here. So for this blob, we can change things up a little bit, which is to go into the Physics tab, make sure we have our blob actor selected, and we'll open up Physics, and we're going to switch our collision shape over to circle. And while I'm at it, let me just go ahead and turn on fixed rotation and bounciness back down to 0. And then I'll go ahead and preview this. And you can see this time he actually misses the surface altogether. And that's because if we were to click on this, instead of the bounding box being between all these points that we see here, it's essentially drawing a circle inside this space. So it actually makes the collision area a little bit smaller. So let's try this again. And you can see that we're never going to get it to work perfectly because, of course, there is no collision shape for a blob character. But this is a little bit more accurate, and our character gets a little bit closer to our block. And you can see that's just a little bit better. So it's not a perfect system inside GameSalad where we can choose the actual pixel values of our images, but it's just very important to realize whether you're working with a cube or a perfect circle or something that just kind of represents a circle a little bit better than a cube, that you have this option here to actually switch the collision shape from rectangle to either circle to pay attention to your actor a little bit better. But more importantly than even this collision shape is just understanding the graphic itself. Now you might be creating your own graphics and understand how to use programs like Photoshop, or maybe you're completely new to image editing programs and you're just getting free graphics from the web. It's really, really important to understand what those graphics look like. So you're going to want to open that up and try to analyze whether there's empty space around the graphic. And in this case, you're going to have a lot of problems where you have this big empty space above our block. But if your graphic looks something like this, where you don't have any of that empty space, then you know that the collision that's going to happen is going to fit the bounding box perfectly. So take the time to analyze the graphics that you either download for free off of the web, and then also make sure that you're paying attention to what the actual collision shape is for those specific actors.